Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Aztec UFO Incident, the case, evidence, and elaborate cover-up of one of the most perplexing crashes in history. By Scott Ramsey, Suzanne Ramsey, and Frank Thayer, Ph.D. Narrated by Paul Woodson. Foreword. By William S. Bill Steinman. Well, once again I was asked to write the foreword to Scott and Suzanne's new follow-up book on the Aztec saucer case. As usual, their last book generated new and more revealing facts to follow up on. Scott continues to pick my brain, which is 30-some-plus years removed from my own investigation. Scott admits that he is obsessively addicted to the Aztec case. I was once addicted, but went into years of rehab. Scott and Suzanne, as usual, left no stone unturned, following each new lead to its very end. They must be congratulated for their very fine effort in solving this many-faceted and many-layered puzzle called Aztec. My own book, UFO Crash at Aztec, just scratched the surface, but it did spark interest in the 1948 Aztec recovery all over again. I believe that the Ramseys investigation will once again prove, without the shadow of a doubt, that an aircraft of unknown origin crash-landed on the rocky mesa 12 miles northeast of Aztec, New Mexico, and was recovered by a covert team of military, scientists, and security personnel, and carted off to a top-secret base for analysis. This new book may prove to be one of the most important ones written in the 21st century. I once again commend the Ramseys on a job well done. Maybe now Scott can get out from under the Aztec yoke of bondage and be free at last to pursue more pleasurable endeavors. William S. Bill Steinman, April 13th, 2015. Preface by Stanton T. Friedman. Because I have been lecturing and writing about flying saucers for more than 40 years, and am the original civilian investigator of the 1947 Roswell crashed saucer incident, I am often asked about the supposed Aztec, New Mexico crashed flying saucer recovery. Early on I had accepted the common wisdom that the Aztec story was just a myth. As I got to know Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, and had access to their extraordinary work, I became more and more impressed. Their efforts are splendid examples of true research. As a nuclear physicist working on classified research and development projects for major companies for 14 years, I had ample time to evaluate scientific investigation. Their work meets all the tests I can suggest. They have spent a truly enormous amount of time, money, and effort to dig out new witnesses, relevant papers, and evidence. They represent the epitome of persistence, honesty, and careful investigation. They raise the false claims of UFO debunkers and carefully demolish them. Frankly, I wish there were many UFO-related investigations done as carefully and energetically. There is no question that an intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft was recovered by agents of the government of the United States near Aztec, New Mexico in March 1948, and taken for classified study and evaluation. This is a fascinating and carefully done expose, well worth reading. Stanton T. Friedman. worldwideweb.stantonfriedman.com. Introduction. On a crisp March morning in the high desert of northwest New Mexico, a goat rancher leaves the comfort of his house and walks toward the corral to let the sheep out to graze. As he opens the gate, he is stunned by a thunderous noise that draws his attention to the sky. Overhead, he sees a large object fluttering as if in distress. When it makes contact with a nearby cliff, sparks fly. And so an incredible chain of events begin that will directly and indirectly impact hundreds of people throughout the world. When people ask me about the topic of our book, I say it is the documentation of an historical event. Initially, I hesitate to use the words flying saucer, because it is so much more. Our research is a compilation of work gathered for almost 29 years. In that time, we have traveled to more than 28 states, personally spent $500,000, and archived 55,000 related documents from sources including the United States Army, United States Air Force, FBI, and CIA, and directly from the desk of J. Edgar Hoover. With our complete focus on the facts, our motive is clear. We provide the evidence. You will come to your own conclusions. A number of researchers, media members, and television producers have encouraged us to sensationalize and speculate on the details of this event. That is not the path that we have chosen. The purity of this incident is so spectacular that there is no need to alter or embellish it. There are certain terms that lose their impact through misuse and overuse. Conspiracy and cover-up are good examples. However, in the case of the Aztec incident, these terms are part of a factual description and are documented as such. During this investigative journey, we share the compelling story of the witnesses to a proved flying saucer landing and recovery, of scientists who worked on the craft, and of the individuals involved in the cover-up in the years since 1948. Finally, we document the astounding and enduring impact of the incident on their lives and on ours. We are dedicated to accurately telling this powerful story, and it is our honor to present it to the listener. Suzanne Ramsey, April 15th, 2015. 1. 8 months after Roswell. The glowing disk was flying erratically in the blackness of pre-dawn on March 25th, 1948. Cuba, New Mexico police officer Manuel Sandoval had seen flying saucers before in the skies of the Four Corners, but this one was not hovering or darting across the sky, as he had become accustomed to. It was obviously in trouble, wobbling as it headed northwest toward Farmington and Aztec. Sandoval had already put in a full day working security for the Southern Union Gas Pipeline, where he was responsible for keeping the pipeline from being tampered with. His part-time shift with Cuba took him deep into the night on the empty highway. The law enforcement witnesses. As he started his shift, Sandoval wondered what the night would bring. For several weeks, Officer Sandoval and New Mexico Highway Patrol Officer Andy Andrews had observed flying saucers on numerous occasions as they traveled the New Mexico highways and byways. For his part, Andy Andrews patrolled from Farmington, New Mexico, south to the pumping station town of Lybrook. Andrews would sometimes travel the extra 38 miles to Cuba, where he would break the loneliness by meeting Sandoval at a cafe for a bite to eat or some coffee and pie. This particular night, as the shift neared its end, Sandoval spotted a large flying disc that seemed to be in trouble. What he was looking at that night was not displaying the hovering capability or the great speeds and agility he and Andrews had observed on other nights. This craft appeared as though it was trying to make a landing. As Sandoval described over the years to his close friends, it was wobbly and seemed to be fluttering as a leaf. The craft was flying very low, barely clearing the canyons, as Sandoval followed the craft heading northwest toward the Four Corners. The Rancher. Valentin Archuleta began his early morning routine as usual this particular day. Walking toward the goat corral to let the goats out to graze, he heard what sounded like a sonic boom. His eyes were drawn to the wide-open sky, where he saw what he described as a flying saucer that seemed to be out of control, heading toward a mesa across the road from his ranch. The wobbling craft scraped the face of the mesa, shooting sparks upon impact. The saucer remained airborne as it headed in a northerly direction. Telesoforo Valentin Archuleta, or Valentin, as his friends and family called him, was finally back on his ranch, after the experience of being a Japanese prisoner of war and being a survivor of the Bataan Death March. Valentin was one of 1,816 New Mexico National Guard soldiers of the 200th Coast Artillery Regiment deployed to the Philippines in September 1941, prior to Pearl Harbor. The 200th assisted the Luzon force when the Japanese attack began on December 8, 1941. Approximately 60,000 Philippine soldiers and the men of the 200th were captured on the Bataan Peninsula in April 1942. Thus began a horrific forced march of the POWs. They were held under extreme conditions until liberated in 1945. All told, 829 of 1,816 New Mexican men died gruesome deaths from starvation, exhaustion, and torture in the battle and forced march. Some were in such a weakened condition that they died immediately after rescue. Note that these numbers only indicate the fatalities of the soldiers from New Mexico. It is a testament to his fortitude and character that Valentin served his country so valiantly and survived to return to his family. Less than 3 years after his return from such heroic and decorated military service, he witnessed the Aztec flying saucer. Archuleta described his sighting to researcher William Bill Steinman in 1982. As he looked up, he saw a large, disc-shaped craft, wobbling as it flew, and seemingly out of control about 100 feet above the ground. The object did strike a nearby mesa, showering sparks as the object continued north and losing altitude as it flew. Valentin quickly headed to the only nearby telephone, which was at the Blanco Mercantile, a general store near his ranch. Local customers had access to the phone 24 hours a day through a door at the store that was always unlocked. Although it took 2 or 3 attempts, he finally got through to Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. On or about the 3rd call, someone from the base answered who actually showed an interest. After Valentin got through, he explained that he had just seen one of those flying saucers that the Air Force was so interested in. The Air Force person at the other end of the line asked him where the craft was heading, and Archuleta informed him it was headed toward Hart Canyon, meaning north-northwest of his ranch. Valentin requested that the Air Force call him back to explain what was happening, but despite their promise, the Air Force never contacted him again. Valentin shared this story over the years, but only to a select few. The mesa, as described by Archuleta, is one of many that surround the ranch. In March 2015, Archuleta's granddaughter, Krista, Suzanne, and I, Scott, decided to go to the top of the mesa to see if they could find any traces of contact on the hard volcanic rock and sandstone. After an hour or so driving up the oil field roads, we made it to the top. A walk of about 1/2 mile to the area described by Archuleta indeed found us overlooking the ranch. After climbing down the face of the mesa, they could clearly see an area that seemed to have mechanical marks on the face of the rock. These marks are many feet up from the base, and there is no real explanation as to how they got there or why they are there. The mesa is comprised of both sandstone at the south end and volcanic rock as the mesa formed to the north. It is unlikely that sparks would be created by hitting the soft sandstone, but the area where the craft hit the top of the mesa is hard volcanic rock. Krista and other family members are certain that nobody over the years has been to this site, as they would require permission from the family to gain access to the mesa. The Oilfield Workers. Doug Noland, a 19-year-old working for the El Paso Oil Company, was on his way pre-dawn to pick up his supervisor and fellow employee, Bill Ferguson, so they could proceed to work in the oil fields south of Aztec, New Mexico. At the time Doug pulled up to Bill Ferguson's house, there is no way that they could have imaged what their day would hold. Both of their lives were about to change significantly. Bill told Doug that a brush fire had been reported out on Hart Canyon Road, about 12 miles northeast of Aztec. There were concerns that it might be burning near one of the company's drip tanks, and they needed to get out there, fast. The day's work plans for the project south of Aztec would have to wait a few hours. The drip tanks sat at the base of a mesa near what oil field workers called the Arkansas Loop on Hart Canyon Road. News of a fire near the tanks was not what oil field workers wanted to hear, considering the amount of oil stored in more than a dozen tanks. Doug and Bill hurried out to the drip tanks, only to be met by a number of other oil field workers who had arrived earlier to investigate. The brush fire appeared to be contained on the top of the mesa, not near the tanks at the side of the road below the bluff. The other workers greeted Doug and Bill, and quickly told them that the storage tanks were not in danger of the brush fire, but something strange was sitting on top of the hill. A unique feature of hills in the Southwest are the flattened tops that led early Spanish explorers to name them mesas, meaning tables in English. Southwest residents normally use the Spanish word when referring to such hills. The two workers quickly clambered to the top of the mesa to see what the other workers were talking about. The craft was extremely large, Doug recalled. I, Scott, interviewed him in August 2003 at his home in Las Vegas, Nevada, while he was still recovering from a series of strokes. He had told the story over the years to select people, but then he said he wanted it on the record. An eerie haze from the brush fire swirled around the workers in the early dawn light as they reached the object. A very large, metallic, lens-shaped craft sat silently atop the mesa. Doug explained that, as the group of young men moved closer, we realized the craft was smooth, with no noticeable seams, rivets, bolts, or weld marks. He said, "It looked as though it was molded." Doug remembered that he and Ferguson cautiously moved closer and actually climbed up on top of the almost 100-foot diameter disc. He recalled, the craft was brushed aluminum, looking to be very smooth, but not highly polished aluminum like you see on an airplane. As they climbed around looking for doors or an entry of some kind, the men found, upon closer examination, what appeared to be portholes of some type. Doug said, "The windows or portholes looked like mirrors until you would look closer, then you could see through them." He recalled years later, when mirrored sunglasses became popular, they always reminded him of the windows on the craft. The other oil field workers were just as curious as Doug and Bill, and they too were climbing all over the craft. "One of the windows or portholes was busted," Doug said. "The hole was the size of a quarter, no bigger as I recall. It was a hole in the window the size of a damn quarter." As Doug and Bill looked through the window, they saw two small bodies slumped over what appeared to be a control panel of sorts, Doug remembered. The sun was coming up by this time, but we could plainly see two bodies. Soon others were arriving at the mesa. Local ranchers, Mr. and Mrs. Knight, who ran cattle near the mesa, arrived in their pickup truck to see what the commotion was about. They parked with the other vehicles and walked up the hill and to the craft, then quickly advised the young men to move away from it. Doug said, "A quick lecture was taking place from the Knights about getting near the damn thing when we heard a sound that was very strange to us." It was a helicopter circling the mesa. Doug said this seemed almost as unbelievable to him as was the metallic disc. "I had never seen a helicopter before in my life." In March 1948, the primary military helicopters were the Sikorsky H-5 series and the Bell H-13. These were small and light machines carrying only 2 or 3 people. They were limited in speed and range. To see a helicopter in the desolate area of Hart Canyon, let alone anywhere else in the late 1940s, would be highly unusual. The object on the mesa that morning must have been of great importance for this relatively new and rare military aircraft to have been dispatched. When I, Scott, interviewed Doug, he realized that after the Knights arrived, a law enforcement officer showed up and acted as though he did not know anyone on the mesa. Doug approached the young officer and asked, "What should we do?" The young officer, whom we have since identified as Manuel Sandoval, explained that he was from the town of Cuba, New Mexico, and that he had followed the low-flying disc-shaped craft in a northerly direction during the early morning hours. He told Doug that it finally led him to the area of Hart Canyon Road. He explained to Doug that the residents of the town of Cuba had reported several sightings of these objects for a few weeks prior to March 25th. The officer also said that he had no idea what to do, as he had noticed that, when the craft passed over Cuba, it was wobbly and seemed to be fluttering as a leaf. Sandoval told Doug that he had decided to follow the craft, not realizing it had come down on the mesa until he spotted the oil field workers' trucks parked out on the road. Sandoval also told Doug that the craft seemed in some sort of trouble and had almost hit a mesa near the town of Bloomfield, just south of Aztec. This matches Archuleta's description of what he saw as well. After talking with Doug, the young policeman then approached the craft, and also told everyone to stay away from it until they were sure of what it was. Some of the young men informed Officer Sandoval that they could clearly see two bodies in the craft, and that the bodies appeared to be slumped over a panel of some sort. About that time, according to Doug, even more people started showing up at the mesa. A law enforcement officer from Aztec, known to some of the young men, showed up, as well as 2 or 3 other young men. Doug recalled, "Nobody knew these latter guys. I don't think they were locals, but that was a long time ago." The local officer spoke briefly with the Cuba officer, and then he announced that the military was aware of the craft and that everybody should leave the area at once. At about that time, Doug said, "The helicopter was leaving the area. It had circled many times, and it turned toward the northeast and disappeared. I don't know at the time what affected me most, the circling of a helicopter or this strange object sitting on the mesa." I asked Doug what his initial thoughts were as to the origin of the craft. He responded, "Hell, this is New Mexico you're dealing with. No telling where or what this thing is. We thought since the helicopter showed up it was one of ours. The war had made New Mexico a training ground for all kinds of stuff back then." Doug also remembered. By the time the local law enforcement officer showed up, Bill, who was ignoring the orders to stay away from the craft, was trying to poke around the craft with a fire pole or something he pulled off of one of the trucks. Soon he hit some damn thing, and a door or walkway appeared. Some of us had to look inside and see what the hell else was in there, and if anyone was in need of help. Doug said the bodies, not moving or showing any signs of life, were charred a dark brown. I mean, they did not appear to be of dark skin, just seemed to have been exposed to heat. I questioned him about this several times, and he stuck to his story about the bodies having the appearance of being charred. Some of the young workers stuck their heads into the craft and told Doug that there were more bodies on another level. Doug described that, from what he could see, the interior of the craft was not burned. Drawing from 50 years of memories, Doug described the craft or disc as about 100 feet across, with a raised section on the top. The bottom of the craft also had a protrusion that stuck out from below. He described the craft as being a very thin cross-section, only about 18 to 20 feet high, but very thin at the outer edges. Doug continued his description of the saucer. He said the outer edge of the craft had some strange gold-color rings, 3, if I remember correctly, that ran around the entire outer edge of the disc. In Doug's memory, it was late morning when the military did show up, and show up they did in a very big way. We never even thought about leaving the mesa, regardless of what the local law enforcement officer was telling us. This event, was too big to walk away from. As he returned to remembering the other people on the mesa that day, Doug could recall most of them, but a few he was not familiar with. There were 2 or possibly 3 young guys about our age that stood away from us at the western side of the mesa. They got near the craft at first, but kept their distance after a while. It's not my poor memory. I never knew who these guys were or where in the hell they came from. As for the local law enforcement officer, Doug said, "I think back then I knew who he was, but not after what I've been through." Here Doug was referring to the strokes he had recently suffered. Doug said he could not remember the local police officer's name, except to say that the man was local and that the other guys knew him as well. Doug was living in Mancos, Colorado at the time, and was familiar with all the Aztec people, as well as county law enforcement, being that the town is also the San Juan County seat. The military was forceful in assembling everyone present at the scene and quickly dividing them up for interviews. They asked everyone's name and address, with whom they were employed, and why they were on Hart Canyon Road in the first place. During my interview, I asked Doug what branch of the military showed up. His response was, "I am still not certain to this day what branch they were from. I don't recall ever seeing anything that told me if it was Army or the new Air Force. All I know was they weren't really young guys. They seemed older and certainly were very well trained as far as getting there and taking over in a very assertive manner. They did not take kindly that we were there." Doug continued, "The vehicles they were in looked like Army, but you are testing my memory with that. The thing that amazed me and Fergie, Bill Ferguson, was how fast they got to where we were. Now think about this. We were in a very desolate area of the country, and they show up in what seemed like only a few hours. But really it was closer to late morning. But still, where did they come from, and how did they get there so fast? Bill and I knew that part of the country pretty damn well." Doug reminded me that they were very young then, but he seemed impressed 50 years later. To have that many people show up at the Mesa in the same morning was something that Fergie and I talked about for years. That's why at first, when we saw the helicopter, but before we realized the bodies and everything sank in, we thought, hell, it's one of ours. I asked Doug what he meant by realized the bodies, and he explained. The bodies were pretty small. After we realized what we were looking at, not a fully grown person size, but smaller, maybe like a child. I asked Doug if it would be fair to say the object, craft, disc, whatever he was describing to me, looked as though it had crashed, and he said emphatically, "No, that would not be a good or accurate description. I could see no damage to the craft at all. It was lying at an angle as though it was lying on the ground with no support, but if it had a bubble or reverse dome on the bottom that was giving it support." Doug Nolan's emphasis. "It was lying as though it needed support or a landing gear. Picture a dome on the bottom of a frisbee that could not lie flat, that kind of thing." Doug continued, "But getting back to your question, no, there was no damage. I would remember that. The trees around the mesa had been roughed up a bit, and some were worse for wear. The craft had plowed into the mesa, and that mesa is mostly silt and rock, with some trees broken off and sand and rocks scattered around. But the craft was not damaged." I then got to the military angle and asked Doug exactly what the military asked or told him. He replied clearly. "They told me this event was extremely important to the United States of America, that we were responsible for our national security, and that we will never talk to anyone about this event. Everyone, with maybe the exception of Mr. and Mrs. Knight, were talked to in private. I mean, we weren't talked to in a group, just kind of one-on-one. They weren't kidding around. They were very serious and not very friendly. I can only speak for myself and what Fergie told me later, but we were threatened with our lives if we ever spoke about this." I then asked Doug whether they offered him an explanation for what they witnessed, and Doug's response was, "We did not see anything according to them. Nothing was there. We weren't there. You see what they were telling us?" Bill Ferguson died long before we got involved with our research into the Aztec incident. I would love to have interviewed Bill as well, but as time went on, we were able to interview others who claimed they were out on Hart Canyon Road in March 1948 for an event that changed their lives. The Ken Farley Story. Randy Barnes, a dear friend of ours, discovered the lead to Ken Farley, and so Randy and I, Scott, decided to meet with Ken north of Phoenix in 1999, where Ken was retired and dying of a respiratory disease. He wanted his Aztec story on the record as well. Farley was visiting his aunt in Durango, Colorado, north of Aztec, and was driving to the small town of Cedar Hill, New Mexico, on the morning of March 25th, 1948, where he picked up a friend. They planned a drive to San Diego to see some California friends. Ken's friend told Ken there was a lot of activity just south of their pickup point near an old dirt road, and he suggested to Ken they should investigate. With no real schedule limitations, the two decided they should see what was going on. Ken told me, Scott, that he and his friend decided to take time to detour from their San Diego destination in order to investigate what might be going on at what turned out to be Hart Canyon Road. The friend had told Ken that there had been some vehicles, including a police car, going in that direction, and that someone possibly needed help. During our interview, Ken told the following story. We arrived at a mesa out about 10 miles or so from the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?